He will start with Dr. Vaughan Turekian. He's from AAAS, United States. He has been in the science policy diplomacy for a long time. He alluded in this pitch this afternoon that he has been one of the leaders of the very important study by national academies for President Bush when he came into position after IPCC. And what he didn't say, President Bush didn't believe that report, and I think he, in his work, somehow managed that they believe it after all. I would like to ask Vaughan to take up the stage.
Thank you so much again, Pavel. I guess this is the third ring of a three-ring circus now, so we can start. It is a great pleasure, as I said earlier, for Excellencies, now colleagues, and now many friends, as I've gotten to have a chance to talk to many of you, or some of you, and interact with more, hopefully over the course of the next few days, or next few hours. Actually, I'm leaving tomorrow morning. So, and I appreciate you saying young leaders. I saw the group that you had stand up, and I'm watching as the years sort of go by, and now my daughter, who I mentioned earlier, said to me something not so long ago, and she said, "Oh, Dad, you're so old." And I was like, "Yes, there it is." Well, and it's a great place to start. So, when I started thinking about this talk, I actually literally changed it about 5 minutes ago, thanks to the help of the technical group here, because when I saw the young people stand up, and so many of them, one of the things that struck me was, as much as we can talk about theories of science diplomacy, and as much as we can talk about a lot of the things we're going to talk about, which are very high-level things, there was probably no greater feeling of the power of science diplomacy than hit my life 2 years ago. This is my son, Chip, Charles Henry Turekian. And this was immediately after he had open heart surgery for something called transposition of the great arteries. And those that sort of know the medical term, transposition of the great arteries is literally the two major arteries, the aorta and the pulmonary artery, are switched. And the result is you actually have two disconnected flows, which result in the fact that the blood's not mixing very well. At all, actually, in his case. And so he was born, complete surprise. Well, it wasn't a surprise he was born. We were pretty much, I think we were on board that that's what was happening. But when he was born, we didn't know about it, this condition. And we went through a very serious period of time, and he had open heart surgery. And when I was able to reflect back upon it, and look back on our journey from the moment he was born until the moment he sort of kind of got a little bit past this stage, I realized that my wife and I and our family were living, in many ways, the benefits of science diplomacy in the United States. Because this was a boy who was diagnosed immediately after birth. In fact, after birth, his OB looked at my wife and me and gave the big thumbs up because he looked bright pink. But it just so happened that my wife had some meconium in her water when it broke. And so out of an abundance of caution, there was a neonatologist in the room when Chip was born. And it was the neonatologist who I just remember hearing so much going, "Come on, get pink, get pink." And everyone saying, "Oh, he's got a breathing problem, suck more air, suck more stuff out of his lungs." And she said, no, it's not a lung problem, it's something else. She reacted extremely quickly and in fact saved his life by doing an emergency procedure. He then was transported to a children's hospital. But I got to know the woman who actually saved his life at the start. And she's this remarkable story of a woman who started her life in Iran, then went to Scotland to get educated with her medical degree, and then attracted by NIH funding, came to Washington, D.C. to continue her studies and her research. In many ways, the investments, and that investment into science that the U.S. had done for so long, and health research particularly, in my mind was one of the reasons why this remarkable woman was attracted to the United States and was there to help my son. The second part of the story is that while he was there, he was operated on by, again, an Australian, probably the top cardiothoracic surgeon for young kids in the world, who was an Australian who did his own little science diplomacy and did his residency in New Zealand and spent time doing very actively there, but then came to the United States, again attracted to the United States because of our large health infrastructure and funding. He was a researcher. And he had perfected certain techniques. 40 years ago, 45 years ago, Chip would not have made it. But over and over, the investment in the scientific enterprise, and actually the attraction in this case of NIH funding, brought these people to the United States and to our benefit. What's interesting about this surgeon, Dr. Jonas, is Dr. Jonas was somebody who I had actually read about earlier. Dr. Jonas, who did the surgery, had been somebody who, when there was a tribal leader's son in Afghanistan during the mid-2000s, who was kept coming back, the son kept coming back, and the medics of the U.S. Army kept seeing this kid and noticing that he was not doing so well. He looked very like he was sort of not getting the great color, all these things. They suddenly realized that, in fact, this child had a major heart problem, not the same one as my son's, but something different. And they brought him and sent him to Washington. They raised enough money, sent him to Washington Children's Hospital, and it was Dr. Jonas that did the surgery that saved his life. And the tribal leader in that region said that it was that surgeon that saved my son's life, and that sometimes, this is his quote, he says, sometimes helping a heart helps a country. And so anyway, I start with this. My son is now 2.5 years old. He's driving his mother crazy. I just got a text from my wife who informed me that Chip, as we call it, his name Charles Chip, is now climbing up on the dog constantly. So it's a pretty remarkable story. I'm now going to get to the mundane part, which is what I do on a daily basis. That was sort of the personal side. But the mundane part is actually what we've been spending a lot of time thinking about, actually not only at AAAS, but more broadly in Washington as a whole, and I think you'll see globally, around this issue of science diplomacy. It's a terminology that has been around for a long time, and which I'll show, but also is something that is now really getting to a point more and more where you're hearing it, at least in the policy circles, being spoken about more and more. And what we've started to find is that we actually have two different worlds, scientists and diplomats. And we sort of think of the world quite different. I've served in both places. I'm a scientist by training who's had the opportunity to work in the foreign ministry in the United States, the State Department. And when you go around and you talk to people and you realize that one of the big things that when we think about as scientists, one of the things that scientists want when we deal internationally, when we deal with our colleagues, is actually something that's sort of been around the science enterprise for a long time. We want access. We want access to our colleagues. We want access to data. We want access to ideas. We want access to students. You know, every now and then we wouldn't mind some access to money, which helps. But it's access-based. Diplomats, and the ambassadors in the room will say this, oftentimes are trying to provide influence on behalf of their country, influencing the way that other countries view their country, influencing maybe the ways that decisions are made on a global scale. When we think about climate change, we're trying to influence, many of the negotiations are trying to influence the outcomes of policy. So the question always becomes, how do you combine these two worlds? One which is driven by trying to access and plug into a global science community, and one that's trying to sort of create some of the influence for how the outcomes come. And I think when we think about things like Future Earth, or we think about any of the issues around sustainable development goals, it's how we combine those two groups, how we change policy making and the science input, that overlap that really becomes telling about what we think about. Well, about 5 years ago, AAAS and the Royal Society did a workshop together on the sort of the basis of science diplomacy. And I don't know, I mean, people that have sort of been around this world have seen some derivation of this in many ways. But we came up with a report and really sort of tried to define what are the key drivers in science diplomacy. Well, we talked a lot about science in diplomacy. And in fact, many of the issues around climate change and around the issues that we think about, you know, with sustainable development goals is really the way that scientists have input into the foreign policy process. Then there's actually a lot for diplomacy for science. And diplomacy for science is actually a place where I think the scientific community needs to be a little bit more savvy. We need to recognize more and more that there are things that we want scientifically, not necessarily influencing decisions, but influencing things like the building of things like CERN, influencing the building of things like ITER, which are difficult, things that actually have a scientific background, where we actually do need more and more of the diplomats to at least come to agreement in order to make things work. This can be both bottom-up and top-down, but it really does involve scientists getting things done, diplomats getting things done for the scientific community. And that's, you know, from a scientific standpoint, placed from a scientific society, is actually really important for us. Finally, there's science for diplomacy. And coming here is like coming to the cathedral for science for diplomacy. It is a place, AAAS, that actually has such a strong and long history in actually doing this. Building relationships. Scientists working together to increase the way that people get along, societies interact with us, and relationships, bilateral and multilateral, I should put multilateral, actually happen. It is places like this, there are some others that are examples I'll show soon, that really do demonstrate the value of institutions for bringing people together around science-based issues. Finally, not finally, sort of in definitional terms, one of the things we've seen more and more of around the world is actually something that we've often called the 3 E's of science diplomacy. And one of my favorites is actually this one, the expressing national power, because it's actually not a U.S. thing. This is actually something we're seeing more and more from countries outside the United States, and I'll show an example of that. This next one is the equipping of decision makers, the conversation we had earlier today. How do scientists help equip decision makers to make the good foreign policy-based issues, or hopefully foreign policy-based issues? And then the last one, which again is a place where IASA is, and the place that I've spent most of my time over the last few years, is enhancing bilateral and multilateral relationships. So Peter Gluckman, I think he was invited to this symposium. He's probably one of my favorite people because he's about as frank speaking as anyone can imagine. He's a New Zealander. He's the chief science advisor to New Zealand. And when we first started having this conversation about 6 years ago about science diplomacy, he said, look, science diplomacy is what New Zealand does. This is what we've got to be doing more of. He said, we're a small country. We're a country that oftentimes doesn't get an opportunity to sit down with the big boys. The one place that we can actually have influence in the world, the one place that we can actually have a very strong voice when decisions are made, is through our scientists. We've got great work being done in greenhouse gas mitigation, particularly around agriculture. They've done tremendous things, particularly with their access to the South Pole and serving as one of the staging stations. That he says here, as a small nation, we must compete hard. We've got to compete with the rest of the world. And it's actually our scientists that actually provide that. This is a way, and this is not just, again, with a small country. We're seeing this more and more with countries around the world, are able to use their talent, their people, the young people that actually we saw standing up. That's the future of science diplomacy. It's the way in which countries are able to express themselves to the world. There aren't many endeavors that governments pay for that are actually international in scale. You think about most of the things that we pay for in government funding tends to be pretty domestic. Building roads, that's pretty domestic. Doing things around regulatory things, like in our country, like the EPA. Doing things around very infrastructure-based. Those are domestic priorities. Defense and science are actually two things that are inherently international in its nature. And more, when we think about diplomacy, science becomes a critical element in the way that countries interact with each other, and therefore how countries can express themselves to the world. One of the things is, though, how do we do this? And this is we call this the Little Green Book in Washington. This was actually the first attempt by the National Academy of Sciences to really try to say, look, you have to realize that science is integral to the way in which foreign policy is conducted. And the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, at the request of then Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, came up with a book called The Pervasive Role of Science and Technology in Health and Foreign Policy. And what they found is when looking at 16 of the foreign policy priorities of the United States, 13 of them could directly be looked at as science, technology, health, or environment. You just look about the broad foreign policy of a pretty big country and say that we could directly find a line where science, health, and environment and technology are there. In fact, if they went back and did sort of a post hoc analysis and realized that it wasn't actually 13 of 16, it was probably more like 15 of 16. This report resulted actually in a massive change in the way in which the United States thought about science and foreign policy. And critically what it did, and I put up here, is it said we need, if more and more issues are going to become science-based internationally, we actually have to have the capacity to do this. And they called for the creation of a science and technology advisor to the Secretary of State. One of the great fans of IASA and one of the great people who I speak to almost on a daily basis is Norm Neureiter. Norm Neureiter was the first science technology advisor to the Secretary of State. He's actually the person that first brought me into the State Department as a AAAS fellow. which is my organization now, which tries to bring more and more scientists into not only the State Department, but other parts of the government as well, early career scientists, to come in and see how this policy apparatus takes place as a scientist coming into it. And probably more so than any other report or anything else, particularly because it came from the academy, this has had the impact and changed the way in which people think about, in the United States, about the importance of science and foreign policy. My third and probably favorite picture that I show here is that enabling the building of trust and relationships, because this is probably one of the most fun parts of science diplomacy. It's also the part that I always get yelled at whenever I show this by my colleague Glenn Schweitzer. Glenn Schweitzer is the gentleman sound asleep in the front row. And I think when I've shown this line before, I realized that the remarkable thing about this is the fact that every other person in this audience is wide awake, except for Glenn, who's in the front row sound asleep. And I always measure my metric of whether or not I'm as captivating a speaker as Joe Taylor, a Nobel Prize winner, is when I can look out in the front row and see how many people are out cold. And right now everyone's sort of awake, so it must be pretty good. Anyway, but Glenn has been working tirelessly to keep a relationship going between the U.S. and the Iranian scientific community over the past 20 years. It's been through ups and downs and ups and downs. One of the things he did was he brought Joe Taylor, again a Nobel Prize winner, to Sharif University in Iran. Because Sharif is sort of the MIT of Iran, for those that don't know. And one of the things I love about this photo is, this is in 2008. In 2008, the relationship between the U.S. and Iran was pretty much not quite at rock bottom. That would happen in the next 2 years. But look at this audience. It's young. It's full. With the exception of my colleague Glenn, it's captivated. And they are there to hear an American scientist talk about his science. The story goes afterwards, they were invited back. And this is, again, Sharif, a very well-known university in Iran. In 2009, they invited Joe Taylor back to come back to Iran, to Sharif University. He couldn't go. Glenn went, stayed awake. And one of the things he said was the reason why they invited him is because they want to unveil, him to be there, while they unveiled a slightly larger than life-size statue of Professor Taylor in the courtyard of Sharif University. Now, you talk about science enabling trust and building bridges and crossing over divides. This is 2009 in Iran, and they're unveiling a statue of an American scientist in the middle of one of their most famous universities. It tells you that scientific excellence is such a key driver of the way in which people want to interact with each other, especially young people, that it goes beyond some of the politics that go up and down. Now, I mean, sorry, and you go back and you think about what's going on right now with the U.S. and Iran negotiations, and the stories of Salahi and Moniz both being at MIT as physicists, and that connection actually helping to provide some commonality for discussion. It's, you know, I think one of the U.S. newspapers said, bring in the scientists to do the diplomacy. I mean, it was like we had written that article ourselves. Anyway, so you know, this is the usual stuff. One of my favorite things about the history of science diplomacy as building of trust is actually this. Does anyone know what this building is? Can you guess? It's actually the Foreign Commonwealth Office in the UK. And the reason why we show this is actually before the British actually had their Foreign Commonwealth Office, the Royal Society had a Foreign Secretary. That in fact, the recognition within the systems that science was an international endeavor was such that when you look at the premier scientific organization in the UK, it had a foreign secretary to engage with the world even before the British had a secretary of state or a foreign minister. Even in my country, it was a very interesting, the Revolutionary War period. The Revolutionary War period was actually one time where scientists and doctors and medical doctors were allowed to go back and forth behind each other's lines without any problems. That you could actually, if you were a scientist or a medical professional, you were because at that time they were not really doctors, they were medically trained experts, they would be allowed to go back and forth behind the British and the American lines. The Revolutionary War also was a time when the U.S. sort of called upon its greatest science diplomat, Benjamin Franklin, to go to France and to prove that the Americans weren't just a bunch of thugs with axes, but we were actually enlightened people and scientists. And that was a key element in the way in which we could actually increase that interaction with the French and ultimately try to get the French to come on the side of the U.S. for the Revolutionary War. Scientists were key to the starting of the country. In fact, the State Department has 2 fellowships. One's called the Jefferson Science Fellowship, which recognizes that Thomas Jefferson, the first Secretary of State, was himself a scientist in everything he did. If you ever get a chance, go to Monticello. You can drink his wine and watch his crazy inventions. But Benjamin Franklin, of course, too, which is another fellowship. Well, I mean, this is again preaching to the choir here when you see the Cold War period, because really that was the period when science diplomacy probably reached its apex in terms of being something that was on the front page, the role of scientists interacting with each other. Here are Kissinger and Nixon, who knows what they're plotting, but one of the things we know that they were thinking a lot about, and my colleague Norm Newreiter was very involved in, is the Nixon goes to China moment. That in fact, while a lot of the conversation was about how does the U.S. engage with China, re-engage with the People's Republic of China at a time when there had not been any relationships, one of the conversations that came up is, well, we can have this conversation about the geopolitics. That's important. That's in the global. But if we don't put substance to it, so this is the geopolitics, but if we don't put substance to it and actually recognize that we have to go beyond just the geopolitics and get the people to interact with each other, then in fact you've got an agreement without substance. And it was in fact the science agreements that are interesting. I always, sometimes when I give this, I show that the U.S. officially recognized People's Republic of China in 1979 in January. President Carter did it. And the first thing he signed was the official recognition. The second thing he signed was the Science and Technology Cooperation Agreement. So 1979, normalization of ties. From 1979 onwards, the numbers of Chinese students studying in the United States, if you watch that number, just increases exponentially. An interesting thing is at that same time, it's a little bit of inertia, so it takes about another year. The numbers of Iranian students, which had been very high up until the Islamic Revolution, drops at that same time. And what you see is this inflection point around 1980, when the numbers of Chinese students, graduate students in the United States, shoots way up, and the numbers of Iranians goes down. So politics actually does affect some of the scientific exchanges of people, not surprisingly. Well, the U.S.-Soviet example, again, is one that's well grounded here, and in fact, it was one of the issues where science was key. I know that, for those that remember this, and I think it's the front half of the room, this was 1986, and this was before, when Reagan was first going over to meet with Gorbachev in 1986, and he had to give his speech to the nation. Why he had to justify, why am I going over there after so many years of tension? And one thing, I'm going there, there's lots of great interest. He gives this address the night before he goes, but he says, look, there are things that we can work on. In science and technology, we can launch new joint space ventures. Mr. Ramesh mentioned the issue of the Montreal Protocol in his remarks today. What an amazing accomplishment when you consider that it really was a science-driven activity. Scientists had input into the whole way in which we thought about this global treaty around this. And in fact, the interesting thing is 1987 was a period where there was not a lot of trust between the U.S. and the Soviets, and yet the scientists interacting with each other could build that trust to address one of the most wicked global problems, which is, at the time, was the chlorofluorocarbons. So I'm going to finish up in the next few slides and just show that we established, so AAAS in this historical context, established in 2008 a Center for Science Diplomacy, which I direct as part of some of my jobs. And one of the things we wanted to do was to really start to think about these issues, look at the historical thing, but actually do science diplomacy. And so this is a picture of me and a group. Can anyone guess where this is? Okay, raise your hand if you think this is in Asia. Okay, raise your hand if you're still awake. Raise your hand if you think this is in East Asia. Okay. So nobody else is allowed. So the 7 people that says in East Asia can answer. Raise your hand if you think this is in one of the Koreas. Okay. Raise your hand if you think this is North Korea. This is North Korea. Okay, there you go. So in fact, the gentleman in the middle there, Peter Agra, for those that don't know him, he's a Nobel Prize winner in chemistry in 2003. he was the president of AAAS. And we decided that one of the things about science diplomacy is you've actually got to show that science can actually build some connection when connections are difficult. So Peter led, and I'm the person next to me, we led a group to go to North Korea in December of 2009. It was about 6 months after my daughter was born, which my wife, again, was very happy about. We went there to basically start having a conversation, seeing, is there anything that we could think about in engaging? There are not a lot of Americans interacting with North Koreans. Well, one of the things we came up with was health issues being a big one, tuberculosis particularly, and drug-resistant tuberculosis. So a year later, we invited a delegation of North Koreans to Atlanta, Georgia. And this is Atlanta, Georgia, and that's the Jimmy Carter Center there. And we invited them. You can see they're there, and the Peter Agra is somewhere in that picture. And we invited them back to have a conversation about drug-resistant tuberculosis. And one of the things they said is, look, we know there's a problem, and we want to find the right people, and it turned out to be at Stanford University, to engage in this dialogue. It actually resulted in some sort of agreement to move forward. Another area where we moved forward was, this is actually from The Economist, was we were able to work with the British Royal Society and AAAS and others to actually begin to monitor a very important volcano that sits, or a mountain that sits right on the border of China and North Korea. It's got strong cultural and historical, it's Mount Paektu, which is very important to the North Koreans because of a historical, cultural piece. And one of the things they say is, this is a supervolcano. There's a big history in it, but it's not well studied. And because of that connection, we were able to get a bunch of scientists, and it continues today, to go to this mountain and begin to take samples and monitor and begin to move students back and forth to begin to think about things. It's science-based. Right. Peter Agra also was very active very early on before the U.S. officially opened up the relationships with Cuba about 6 months ago, in beginning to build relationships with Cuba. Those that know the U.S.-Cuba relationship know it's very complicated. It's got a very long historical piece to it. It also is a place that's 90 miles away from the United States. Issues of health and environment overlap them completely. So Peter here, who's again, he's a hematologist by training, but he had actually met with Fidel Castro, and we talked a lot about science exchanges. We'd gone back and forth for this, and then last April, before the official opening, we went, that's me down there, and our former president, Jerry Fink, and our former CEO, Alan Leshner, went to Cuba and began to ask the question, what does it mean to actually have science embedded? You know, Mr. Mayor, you made a comment about the question about the issue around making sure that science is at the table when decisions are made, when things are changing. One of the things we were saying is, as the relationship with Cuba changes, you can't forget about the science pieces of it. And one of the things we were talking about was infectious diseases are really important. And so we wrote an editorial in Science, said, you know, these are the types of things that need to change in order for a good policy to come in place. And there's a history of collaboration. We were very pleased that when President Obama announced his change in policy, one of the things he alluded to was the importance of maintaining scientific and health research collaborations between the two countries, and in fact, many of the new sort of things that they're doing reflect that. And those that know that the cover of Science magazine about 2 weeks ago shows the robust nature of, I mean, this is the cover of Science magazine. When I grew up, I don't know, there was a big thing to be on the cover of the Rolling Stone, like that was sort of like a thing you wanted to be, Rolling Stone magazine. I guess now in this world, to be on the cover of Science is the big deal. So this was actually a big change. So we also do a lot of other things. We've had a really interesting international conference on science diplomacy. We're really, again, we're looking at not diplomacy. We're looking at the science issues that drive diplomacy. And it's all going to be online. You can look at it. Finally, we published the journal Science and Diplomacy, and it's open access, sciencediplomacy.org. It's a freebie. Our CEO yells at me when I say that. It's open access for anyone who wants to read it, whenever you want to read it. But we have some really interesting things that we're seeing, which is that more and more countries are investing in their science as a key part of their diplomacy. And I just sort of throw things that we see. Science is a tool of national influence, and we're seeing in Japan and South Africa, New Zealand I mentioned, we're seeing more and more of those, the Canadians. We're seeing large-scale projects as big pieces of the way in which we think about science diplomacy. We see a lot of things around mechanisms. You know, this whole issue around how we think about science and technology agreements. I've had this conversation with others around how other countries think about these things. And critically, how do we get science to build bridges? And there are lots of things, you know, the latent health cooperation between Russia. IASA is a great example of the types of things that are being done to build these bridges. And finally, science to address probably some of the most wicked transboundary issues around biodiversity and sustainability. So I'll pretty much end there. I'm going to be back in this area next week because one of the things we do, and this is more for the young people here, is we do a science diplomacy short course at the former Third World Academy of Sciences, TWAS. And what we try to do is to get early career scientists to come and have a robust interaction with the science diplomacy community. So thank you so much.